Immersed, as many of us are, in a culture that frames regular therapy as part of a well-balanced self-care routine, and inundated by therapy speak reels on social media, I was shocked when a friend of mine, who has never been to therapy and likely never will, asked curiously, "Why is it that people go to therapy again?" This innocent question reminded me that in all its claims for evidence-based efficacy and reports of increased use in recent years, therapy is still a culture-bound phenomenon, a construct peculiar to a secular, science-driven, progressive culture. Psychotherapy's evolution has followed from the birth of psychology as a distinct discipline in the late 1800s, to the prominence of psychoanalysis in the early part of the 20th century, to the movement toward cognitive therapies of shorter duration, what is referred to as the cognitive revolution, in the latter part of the 20th, and finally to the destigmatization of mental illness and growing numbers seeking treatment in the post-COVID-19 era. There is, of course, a paradox to this growing reliance on psychotherapy. An increase in the number of people diagnosed with depression and anxiety, for example, and treated with psychotherapy, could mean that the world is getting sadder and more stressed out. Or the destigmatization of therapy could mean that individuals seek out therapy more readily, compelling therapists to diagnose psychiatric conditions more often, for insurance billing purposes, thus increasing the report rate of mental illness. On the other hand, if people feel better when they take psychopharmacological medication and speak to a therapist every day, an increase in the use of therapy and report of psychiatric illness could indicate a qualitative decrease in the subjective experience of distress in the average American. Then again, it could be that, as critics of the mental health awareness movement have highlighted, a cultural shift toward prioritizing emotional experience in subjective consciousness could be creating a generation of individuals who are hypersensitive to emotional discomfort and poorly equipped with the tools to tough it out. See my episode on Albert Ellis's rational emotive behavioral therapy that incorporates some of this pull yourself up by your bootstraps methodology. Surely, avoiding interpersonal friction and staring at one's belly button, as one critic puts it, can lead to a state of consciousness that, while perhaps advanced in the powers of subjective precision, can lack the distress tolerance required for social and professional gameplay. So what's the purpose of therapy? In past essays, often with my tongue in my cheek, I've spoken of therapists filling a spiritual role in the modern secular zeitgeist, suggesting that they perform a role similar to those filled in times past by the church confessional, the magic man or woman, the guru, or other healers designated by the community to handle issues of mental stress. And while we know that psychotherapy is effective at a subjective level, that is to say that across numerous studies people report that they feel better after undergoing treatment, and at an objective level, their brains change too, it operates in an epistemological gap between the evidence-based hard sciences and the mysteries of interpersonal healing across the social synapse. Therapy is something more, dare I say, something spiritual? The German-American philosopher and psychologist Eric Fromm, who lived from 1900 to 1980, tackles this something more in his 1960 book Zen Buddhism and Psychoanalysis, wherein Fromm, who identifies himself as a humanist psychoanalyst, outlines the overarching ethics of his application of the art form, and connects the goal of psychoanalysis with Zen Buddhism's Satori, the fullest state of enlightened awareness. Fromm does not shy away from articulating the spiritual dimension of psychoanalysis. While Fromm is clear that, and I quote, "psychoanalysis is a scientific method, non-religious to its core," end quote, he speaks to psychoanalysis's role in addressing the lack of religiosity that he found in Western culture, using the term religious in a way that only a mid-century writer like himself could, someone who had yet to experience the full force of Protestantism's 1990s to 2000s era greed. Psychoanalysis, of course, is rooted in the work of Freud, a man who was in no way ambiguous about his distaste for, particularly Abrahamic religions. Freud doggedly refused to fall back on the crutch of supernaturalism in his work. This obsession led to the robust theory of human psychology that is still leveraged by numerous psychotherapeutic modalities today. Critics of psychoanalysis are partly correct in their accusations that it is not scientific. Freud did not have the neuroscientific tools that we have today to tie his work to materialist science. And although the behavioral aspects of psychology can be measured, theories of the intangible mind cannot. However, such criticism misses the philosophy of scientific positivism that Freud brought to each psychoanalytic session. In Freud's view, the psychoanalyst acts as a scientist in the moment, developing theories about the client's mental landscape, creating hypotheses, and testing these against the body of data collected from the client through free association. After defending the scientific nature of Freud's work, Fromm proceeds to describe it with distinctly spiritual language. According to Fromm's reading of Freud, an aspirational ethic at the heart of psychoanalysis transcends the clinical model. He puts it this way, and I quote, "If we look more closely, we find that behind this concept of a medical therapy for the cure of neurosis was an entirely different interest, rarely expressed by Freud, and probably rarely conscious even to himself. This hidden or only implicit concept did not primarily deal with the cure of mental illness, but with something which transcended the concept of illness and cure." End quote. Interestingly, Fromm calls out Freud on his own unconscious shadow. In stark contrast to Freud's stubbornly analytical and reality-bound exterior, he harbored a latent desire to see the client progress beyond the absence of clinically significant psychopathology to a heightened state of wellness. Call it transcending, thriving, achieving self-actualization, or being saved. The implicit goal was aspirational. By now I'm sure my readers' culty red flags are beginning to flutter. So let's address it. In the past, psychoanalysis has not gone uncriticized for occasions of groupthink, resulting from narcissistic dynamics between supervisors and supervisees. Additionally, it's not uncommon for psychotherapists to identify with their modality so strongly that they defend it as if it would be a faith. Indeed, the intensity with which one studies a complex philosophical framework, such as those used in psychotherapy, inevitably leads to a dominant pattern of thinking and communication in a clinician. Whether it's psychodynamics, cognitive approaches, internal family systems theory, or the spiritual language of psychedelic practitioners, advanced studies make us who we are. Each practitioner operates in their distinct Kuhnian paradigm. Making it worse, the edged nuggets of rigorous but incomplete scientific research are buffed away and presented as glimmering gems of therapeutic wisdom at the level of the podcast and the undergraduate textbook. My point is that the secularist ought not to imagine that there is some haven of objectivity and rationality in the psychological sciences. This may have been Freud's blind spot, but it wasn't Fromm's. Shying not away from superlative language, Fromm articulates the philosophical position of psychoanalysis in the following, and I quote, "It is one in which not the negative aim of the absence of sickness, but the positive one of the presence of well-being is aimed at. And that well-being is conceived in terms of full union, the immediate and uncontaminated grasp of the world." This full union and immediate and uncontaminated grasp of the world is what Zen Buddhism might call satori. The art of Zen includes more than the contemplative practices that have been bastardized for inclusion in glossy Whole Foods checkout line magazines about mindfulness. Meditation is just one part of a set of cognitive exercises designed to induce the state of enlightenment known as satori. One such device is the koan, a riddle-like statement that confuses and challenges the mind such that it abandons repetitive and banal thought patterns and moves towards insight and intuitive understanding. Another is the interaction between the disciple of Zen and the Zen master, that Fromm directly compares to psychoanalysis. The Zen master's paradoxical and evasive wit progressively exposes the disciple to their cognitive assumptions, prompting their deconstruction in consciousness and yielding fresh approaches to the challenges and potentials of everyday life. Fromm elaborates on the shared goal of Zen and psychoanalysis in the following, and I quote, "To arrive at the experience of oneness with all that exists, and yet to experience myself at the same time." In psychoanalytic terms, this state results from a greater awareness of the relationship between conscious and unconscious functions of the mind that's facilitated by psychoanalysis. Through the transference between analyst and patient, and the analyst's interpretations of the client's psychological experiences, the filter of social experience by which we view the world dissolves. More on this in a bit, resulting in a more pure engagement with immediate experience. The goal of psychoanalysis, according to Fromm, is to release the unconscious from repressive defense mechanisms, such that a fluid interaction of unconscious and conscious processes provides the client with insights to navigate life decisions and moderate psychic disturbances. The ever-demonized ego facilitates the interplay of conscious and unconscious material in the mind. A healthy ego does this well. The higher state of union with the world that Fromm suggests is not a complete loss of self. To clarify this point, Fromm contrasts it with Christianity's dying to oneself, explaining that surrendering one's will and egoism in Zen or psychoanalysis does not carry the risk of later sacrificing it to an authoritarian father god, or, I will extend, a communal mother god. The oneness Fromm describes includes both the subordination of individualism to the collective and the assertion toward the collective mind of the individual's intuitive subjective truth. This more nuanced approach to the ego balances the dangers of both the competitive self-interested will, narcissism, and the passivity of many meditative approaches that emphasize too heavily the negation of the self, without adequately addressing the need to assert the intuitive will to reach productive and creative engagement with the world. The goal of both psychoanalysis and Zen is freedom to experience and express the full potential of the individual. Removing repressive mechanisms frees an individual to their full potentiality. As the Lacanian psychoanalytic philosopher Slavoj Žižek states, psychoanalysts are possibly the most free. Or as Fromm has it, and I quote, "Zen liberates all energies properly and naturally stored in each of us, which are in ordinary circumstances cramped and distorted, so that they find no adequate channel of activity, giving free play to all the creative and benevolent impulses inherently lying in our hearts." End quote. Fromm discusses three mechanisms that cramp and distort, and that, when removed, allow us to reach the spiritual goal of Satori. 1. Parataxic distortion. 2. False consciousness. And 3. Cerebration. Let's start with parataxic distortion. The first of Fromm's obstacles to enlightenment is parataxis. In object relations theory, the idea that we create internal representations of reality that function as objects in our psychic plane, parataxic distortion refers to the mind's tendency to create distorted representations of reality based on childhood fantasies and early traumatic experiences. Parataxic distortion also occurs in the therapy room between the therapist and the client. And this goes to answering the question, why go to therapy? Because this question is most accurately answered by the client themselves. When the client presents to therapy, they bring with them the object in their consciousness of the therapist. They appear to therapy with a self/socially created concept of what the therapist will be. The nature of this object relation will change based on the social and cultural understanding of the role of the therapist. Are they a doctor, healer, helper, friend? And of course, in the classical Freudian sense, the familial, father, mother, sister, brother, son, daughter, or romantic sexual partner. The therapist allows this parataxic distortion, this transference, and they play the part of the therapist in the interaction. Therapy essentially concludes when the client realizes that not only is their conceptualization of therapist distorted, a false construction of their own ego in the societal mind, but so is the object of the client. Fromm puts it this way, and I quote, "Only when the patient gets in touch with his unconscious can he overcome the distortions produced by himself and see the person of the analyst, as well as his father, his mother, etc., as it is." End quote. When the client reaches the epiphany that they sit in a room alone with another human, engaging in a peculiar form of communication in an artificial relationship, when the psychic objects therapist and client cease to be distorted, so does the mediating concept therapy. To sum it up, when a client comes to the experiential insight that there's no difference between them and the therapist, that the therapist performs an interpersonal and communicative art, much in the way that the client must do outside the therapeutic chamber to maintain their romantic, familial, and professional relationships, the parataxic distortion has resolved and therapy has concluded. I need to stop talking or I'll put myself out of a job. Let's move on to false consciousness. Fromm speaks about the impact of the social milieu on an individual's cognition. In Fromm's language, cultural cognition creates a social filter. that bars authentic experiencing of the subject's interactions with the world. Fromm explains that we naturally have this sort of unfiltered interaction with the world when we're children, but gradually lose it as we're compelled to comport our perspectives to those of primary attachment figures, peers, and the social infrastructures into which we are absorbed over the lifespan. To get an understanding of the social filter, you might compare a child's initial experiencing of the printed paper that is the $100 bill to their later interpretation, layers of interpretation that will be gathered towards it as they grow. Social learning induces a false categorization of the world. Engagement with the world becomes engagement with the words and symbols that the child has been taught to associate with their raw experience, that is divorced from their unique perception and intuition. Fromm puts it this way, and I quote, "Most of what is in our consciousness is false consciousness, and it is essentially society that fills us up with these fictions and unreal notions. The effect of society is not only to funnel fictions into our consciousness, but also to prevent awareness of reality." End quote. The process of psychoanalysis and Zen is to attain reflexive awareness of the social filter and its accompanying defense mechanisms and affective distortions, and move to a more authentic engagement with the world. Satori. Fromm is not unlike other counterculturalists of his time. The call by the likes of Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, and Alan Watts, and others to wake up to a socially programmed way of thinking. Interestingly, while movements such as this in Fromm's era were from the left, they hail from the right in our time, in the form of appeals to stand up to the dominance of intellectual movements over public discourse that has resulted from the shift in power from top-down authoritarian infrastructures of the pre-internet age to the seductive influence of aesthetics and social capital, mediated by the almighty algorithm and the herd mind of viral internet activity. Memes acting as memes in a Dawkinsian sense within the social filter. But regardless of the dynamics of power that lead to the creation of the social filter, its stickiness results from the threat of ostracism at the violation of a taboo. Fromm puts it this way, and I quote, "The individual is so afraid of the implied danger of ostracism that he does not permit himself to be aware of the forbidden impulses. Unless he is to become insane, he has to relate himself in some way to others. To be completely unrelated brings him to the frontier of insanity." End quote. When not reckoned with explicitly as a raw affective sensation, the fear of ostracism, which evolutionarily speaking is a very legitimate biological fear of organismic danger resulting from the separation from the herd, is channeled into repressive defensive mechanisms. This fear meets a conflicting drive, what Fromm describes as an evolutionary ethic of the totality of man that drives us towards life, transcendence, and productive action in service of the universal aims of the species. In Fromm's humanistic view, the enlightened individual balances these two drives, the fear of alienation and the collective ought of humanity. Here's Fromm again on the connection between fear of alienation and humanitarian interest. To the degree to which a person, by his own intellectual and spiritual development, feels his solidarity with humanity, the more can he tolerate social ostracism, and vice versa. The ability to act according to one's conscience depends on the degree to which one has transcended the limits of one's society and has become a citizen of the world, a cosmopolitan. With the support of the ontologically secure practitioner, or Zen master, the client reckons with the alienation of who they are as a whole person from who they are as a social person. They gain reflexive awareness of the social filter, and remove the repressive mechanisms that distort the intuitive truth of their unique subjective experience. Finally, we have cerebration. Cerebration refers to the human tendency to replace reality with symbols. Fromm captures the essence of the Tao in the following passage, demonstrating how the use of symbols to describe experiences, as in language, inevitably results in an alienation from the fullness and immediacy of subjective experience. I quote, "As soon as I have expressed something in a word, an alienation takes place, and the full experience has already been substituted for by the word. The full experience actually exists only up to the moment when it is expressed in language." End quote. According to Fromm, cerebration is exacerbated in the West because of our philosophical bent towards intellectual forms of knowledge, that results from the popularity of scientific and technological progress in our era. We experience words and symbols and their effects in consciousness, rather than the intuitive form of knowing central to Satori. Deeper insight into the function of the conscious and unconscious mind allows the client to bypass cerebration and access a more fundamental insight. Since the days of Jung, psychoanalysts have pioneered the introduction of Eastern philosophical thought into the treatment of mental unwellness. Something about Eastern spiritual thought disrupts the neurotic Western mind and can be leveraged in the clinical setting. Fromm finds the therapeutic usefulness of Zen to the Western mind in the contrast between Aristotelian logic and paradoxical logic. The latter is prominent in Chinese and Indian thinking, from which Zen evolved, and in the dialectics of Hegel and Marx. Fromm explains that Aristotelian logic follows three discrete laws which form the foundation of the Western social filter. Number 1, the law of identity. A is A. Number 2, the law of contradiction. A is not non-A. And 3, the law of the excluded middle. A cannot be A and non-A, neither A nor non-A. On the other hand, paradoxical logic does not reject A is non-A by means of a connective characteristic that binds the two. For example, while black is not white by Aristotelian logic, paradoxical logic allows for the assertion that black is white, in that both are colors, or, more correctly, that neither describes a place along the gradient of light frequencies between the full presence or full absence thereof. Both are non-colors. This sort of speech can initially feel like a riddle to the Western mind. Recall the image of the cheeky Zen master, who frustrates and tempts his student by appearing to know something that the student does not. The Zen master's use of paradoxical logic forces the student's thought in alternative directions, bypassing banal connections induced by repressive mechanisms, and interrupting a distressing pattern. Discovery of the mediating X may bring an unconscious defense mechanism into awareness and results in a flood of repressed emotion as the student is brought in touch with the drive that had been barred from consciousness. The client experiences an epiphany, a sudden moment of intuitive insight and understanding. Fromm puts it this way, and I quote, "The authentic psychoanalytic insight is sudden. It starts not in our brain, but, to use a Japanese image, in our belly. It cannot be adequately formulated in words, and it eludes one if one tries to do so. Yet it is real and conscious, and leaves the person who experiences it a changed person." End quote. The therapeutic benefit of the shift between Aristotelian logic and paradoxical logic induced by psychoanalysis or Zen could relate to movement in the brain associated with analytic versus intuitive problem solving. Researchers Kunios and Beeman, 2009, explored this relationship by priming test subjects with two sets of questions, some that could be answered analytically and some that would be solved with insight, and monitoring the brain areas involved. They found that, and I quote, "Before the presentation of problems to be solved with insight, EEG revealed greater neural activity over the temporal lobes of both cerebral hemispheres, i.e. around the ears, and over the midfrontal cortex. Before the presentation of problems to be solved analytically, there was more neural activity measured over the posterior visual cortex." End quote. In short, insight-based problem solving and analytical problem solving look different in the brain. The researchers also found greater activation of the visual cortex in analytical problem solving, as the subjects prepared to look outwardly for the information needed to process the cognitive challenge. However, for problems that would be solved with insight, activation in the anterior cingulate, a brain area that acts like a manager of cognitive attention, identifies conflicting information, and allocates attention to relevant information, indicated that the subjects were turning their attention inwardly to search for what the researchers called weakly activated potential solutions, which they connect to the subconscious by saying this: "We therefore hypothesized that, in this situation, the anterior cingulate may be involved in the readiness to detect weakly activated subconscious solutions and to switch attention to them when they are detected." End quote. From this perspective, the shift from Aristotelian logic to paradoxical logic, as induced by the art of Zen or psychoanalysis, represents the movement from analytic problem solving to more nuanced, insight-based subconscious problem solving. a shift managed by the anterior cingulate, as attention is drawn away from the visual cortex and toward the lexical-semantic processing areas above the temporal lobes of both cerebral hemispheres and the midfrontal cortex. Cool stuff. Fromm calls the overcoming of defense mechanism and repression a radical aim. If the therapist does not maintain this secret radicalism, the lofty goal of satori for their client, they could curtail the positive effects of their art. The therapist operates within the gaps in the scientific and clinical paradigms, harnessing the seductive power of an unknown potential in the client, by refusing to explicitly know it. After all, how could they? Fromm says that the limited aim of remission of symptoms cannot be reached as long as it is not fit within a wider humanistic frame of reference, that of the life drive of the species toward the evolutionary progress of humanity as a whole. It's a shoot for the stars, land on the moon kind of situation, wherein the psychoanalyst holds the aspirational goal of guiding their client to satori and contributing productively to the universal goals of humanity. The intimacy of the therapeutic relationship is no less radical. Fromm repeatedly uses the concept of the midwife to explain how the psychoanalyst guides the client in rebirth and awakening to a new state of being. While the therapist must have professional boundaries, Fromm artfully expresses the limits of boundary setting itself by saying this, and I quote, "There are limitations in time and space, but there is no limitation in the here and now of the encounter between patient and analyst. When this encounter takes place, there is nothing more important in the world than their talking to each other, for the patient as well as for the analyst." End quote. Fromm, like Jung before him, discusses the possibility that the client heals the counselor in moments of mutual enlightenment and insight that become illuminating and changing for both client and therapist. As Fromm puts it, the analyst not only cures the patient, but is also cured by him, alluding to the clinical phenomenon wherein, due to the intimate synchrony between the client and therapist, and the rupture and repair thereof, residual psychic objects of the therapists are left with the client, and those of the client with the therapist. The therapist's skill lies in their ability to engender these moments, and tolerate their own alienation as they connect and disconnect in such an intimate way with client after client. I can only imagine a psychotherapy clinic website promising new clients full union and uncontaminated grasp of the world. The therapist might just as soon promise that their client will be like God, knowing good and bad, or perhaps to be born again, having their garments washed white with the blood of the Lamb. So the radicalism remains a secret. We may be compelled to play the clinical game, to speak the language of the medical model with its delineation of disorders and symptoms, but make no mistake, the real goal is nothing short of spiritual.